I didn't want them to get married. It took everything out of me not to object. But I didn't want to ruin that fantasy.
What is it about this man that she's so drawn to? I was honestly very frightened for her and the girls. I was very afraid.
As long as he was gonna make everything right, then she was gonna stick beside him. The beauty and the beast, but without the beast changing.
Look at me like that, bitch. I'm not playing with you, place.
911, what is the address of your emergency?
She deserved more. Yeah.
Olivia! I'm at home. Please, her. Please, please. My wife, please!
We grew up in a household of five siblings, and Olivia being the oldest, me being the second oldest. Olivia was a beautiful person, inside and out. She was just very loving and caring. We're less than a year apart, so when I graduated, I moved out of my mom's house and moved with Olivia and her husband. My sister wanted to bring me under her wing, basically show me how to find a job.
I would always call her Fabulous Olivia. So this is probably one of those moments. She got the shades on, the drink, got her nails done, and the swimsuit. So this was just Olivia being fabulous. I know she was my sister-in-law, but I always say she was my sister because we talked about everything.
Olivia went into the tax business where she became very successful.
She was just always into something that was business oriented.
This is when Olivia first became a mom. This is my sister Courtney. This is Olivia. This is my mother when she had short hair. And this is Ariel.
Mom looks so young. She looks so young. It was pretty cool growing up. We used to go camping a lot, going swimming, climbing trees and stuff like that. She always made sure that we had everything. Basically a kid's like fantasy.
The divorce with her and Al was very upsetting to her, very disappointing. I feel like it also made her insecure in areas. And she was still just trying to make sure that her and the girls were good.
She really had to start over. She definitely did want to meet someone new. She wanted to get that family aspect back.
She seemed reluctant, to kind of move forward. But, I told her, I say, hey, you got to put yourself out there. You need to date, have fun again.
I knew that she wanted to find someone that was actually going to love her and just be all for her.
When I first heard the news that Olivia had met someone, I welcomed it because I want to see her happy.
She always talked about how cute he was and he has a good job.
He worked for the state of Texas as a prison guard. You would think that as a prison guard, they would be some type of protector for their families, for sure. As long as I can remember as a kid growing up, we used to have football Sundays where on a Sunday you come together, you come at somebody's house, and there's a lot of good food to eat and there's a lot of good football to watch.
Football Sundays at my in-laws. I had never seen anything like it until I married into this family. We would go straight after church and stay there until like 10 o'clock, sometimes later. Everybody will still be there, be a packed house.
Just a lot of good family time and got a lot of good family fun. And Olivia was the centerpiece of all of that.
First time I met Chris, I remember Miss Anita offering him, which is my mother-in-law, offering him some food. Olivia was sitting next to him. And he said, yeah, you can go fix me something to eat. He told Olivia to go and fix the food. And I just kind of brushed it off. I said, well, maybe he's just one of those guys, you know, very old school.
The first time I met Christopher, his whole dynamic was just off to me. When you talk to him, he comes off as arrogant. He is a know-it-all. And he used to tell me all the time, like, oh, I'm gonna marry your mom and all this stuff. And yeah, I would be like, no, you're not. Like, no, you're not. And I would run and tell my mom, like, no, you're not gonna marry this man. Please don't marry this man.
Early on in their relationship, Olivia and Christopher Jones had went out to a local restaurant in Beaumont, Texas one night. There was a young lady that Christopher Jones had been dating before. He got upset and started an altercation with Olivia.
We just happened to be there, and I guess this was a first date for them. And then we see these girls just jumping Olivia. It was 3 of them, and she was by herself. And one took off her shoe and was hitting Olivia in the head with it. You had one holding her, and the other one was just kind of fighting. Chris, and this is something I'll never forget, is not doing anything. I remember him laughing with his 2 friends.
At the time, the police was called, and of course, that's when Christopher Jones really tucks his tail and runs.
And I just remember Olivia getting in her Suburban at the time, and she was blood and was red and was crying a whole lot. And I remember trying to tell her, Olivia, calm down. And she was like, no, I want to go home. After the fight happened, I did contact Olivia. I said, you need to press charges.
But Chris told her to not file a police report because he was working at the prison at that time. So he didn't want it to come back on him. I never had a good feeling from Chris. Never. But she didn't see that.
Myself, my wife, and my kids, and Olivia and her children were at a local park here in Beaumont, Texas. We had been at the park playing and catching up. Noticed that my sister's phone kept ringing, but she would never answer it. And it would ring back to back to back, basically, and she would never pick up the phone. Olivia and her kids had got into her car, and all of a sudden we see a truck kind of fly into the parking lot.
And I was like, well, who is this? And then I see Chris jump out the truck, leave his door open, and I see him punching her glass window. Like, he kept punching it, and at this point, Josh, he sees what's going on.
When I seen him bamming on the window, I immediately started running up to the situation with my wife grabbing me, trying to hold me back.
And I just remember pulling my husband's shirt because I'm like, we got the kids right here, and I'm telling the kids, y'all stay right there. And then at the same time, I'm on the phone with 911. And I see Olivia crying and screaming, please stop, Chris, please stop.
I heard my Aunt Brittany say, I'm gonna call 911, I'm calling 911 right now. And that's when he jumped in his truck and he sped off. And I remember him speeding off because he turned the corner so fast it looked like the truck was gonna flip.
And at this point, my kids are hysterical. And I looked over and Yalia and Ariel weren't crying. When I noticed that, I instantly said, oh, they've seen this before.
When I got up to the vehicle and Olivia was crying in the seat, and at that point, that's when Olivia shut down. And she didn't want to talk about it.
After that altercation, it did change our relationship with Olivia. She stopped talking to us for about a year.
Looking back at it, I should have pressed it more. He isolated her, made her feel like the only people that was there for her was his side of the family.
They didn't try to justify it. They just said that they were going to counseling, that he was getting better, and he would basically never do it again. Turn around. Ooh!
I believe when Olivia cut us off around that time, she was in love with Chris. She was embarrassed by what he had done. And I think she wanted everyone to believe that their relationship was good. They were in a good space. From the conversations we had with my mother-in-law, the family, you know, just thought Chris was just this really good guy. But me and Josh, my husband, we knew the truth, and we knew he had a dark side.
Lily, I'm a lady. I'm gonna protect you with my life. There's only one way I can do it. You gotta be my wife.
Come on. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Come on, baby. Come on. Say yes.
I just remember seeing on social media that he proposed to her and they got engaged.
When she told us, I didn't have no words.
I think she considered, you know, this will make sure my girls are taken care of.
I didn't want him to be my stepdad, and I didn't want him in my life.
Olivia told me about Ariel having her reservations. And like I told her, you have to listen to your child. But she felt like it was because Ariel didn't want to see her move on with someone besides her dad.
As long as he made it seem like he was changing, that he was gonna make everything right, then she was gonna stick beside him. The Beauty and the Beast, but without the beast changing.
Deep down in my heart, I was very confused. I was wondering, what is it about this man that she's so drawn to? Why does she feel like him controlling her is love? And I was honestly very frightened for her and the girls. I was very afraid.
It was hell, basically. Chris definitely brought the prison to his house. He ran it like a prison. He oversaw it as a prison. So everything had to be done at a certain time, by a certain way. Rooms had to be clean at all times. We couldn't have literally anything on the floor. The beds had to be made. It couldn't have no wrinkles or anything in the comforter. Like everything had to be straight, and like you had to literally take your hand and straighten out the blankets. Pillows had to be nice and neat. If we had the TV on and if he didn't like what was on the TV, he'd either make us cut it off or he'd make us change it. If you weren't in the room during the day, the door had to be open. So that way, if anyone came down the hallway, they would see how nice and neat everything was. The dishes had to be done every night, washed. The floors had to be cleaned every night. The rugs had to be cleaned every night. And his number one rule was like, whatever happens in this house stays in this house. One day, my mom called me into the kitchen and I told her, hey, like, I'll be right there. And he actually whooped me with the belt because he said that I shouldn't talk to my mom like that. It was a very difficult situation to be in. I feel like people need to know what's going on, especially like your family. And if they know what's going on, then they can help you. My mom and her mom talked every morning. And when she passed, it basically took away her other half. Chris tried to make it seem like he cared. He tried to make it seem like, oh, he was just so devastated. My mother-in-law passed away, but in all honesty, he really didn't care.
In our culture, and someone passed away, of course, everyone navigated to that house. And I just noticed that Chris was never there.
After my mother-in-law passed away, we got really, really close. And I just remember she called me and I remember her whispering. And I said, why are you whispering? And she said, girl, because he got them cameras in there and I don't want him to hear what I'm saying. And I was like, huh?
There were a total of 10 cameras. There were 2 in the front. Then they had one pointing towards the hallway right above the front door. He had another one in the corner of the living room, so you can see the full living room and the kitchen. Like every inch of the house was covered in cameras except for our bedrooms and the bathroom.
That was just real creepy for me. You have no privacy, Olivia can't have a decent conversation without, him knowing about it.
He could look at the cameras anytime he wanted to. He can also talk through the cameras and we can actually talk to him back. So if while he was at work and he seen that we were in a hallway or something, he can actually talk through it. And there were also night vision. Everything was very disturbing. Because if you were living in a house, then you would know, like, this should not be happening. You're not supposed to be living in fear. One night, Chris and my mom were in the room arguing. The door was shut. And all I could hear was like, Chris, I can't breathe. Chris, I can't breathe. And I opened the door and I said, Mama, are you okay? And the door quickly slammed. And it slammed so fast that it hit my forehead. He came out and he started yelling at me. He started putting his finger right here on my forehead and like pushing me back. And I was like, you think I'm just gonna let you put your hands on my mom? And she's telling me, she's screaming out she can't breathe. Are you crazy? I said, Mom, are you really gonna let him do this to you? Why are you doing this? Why are you allowing him to do this? And she basically said, Ariel, when I feel like enough is enough, then I'm gonna leave. And I said, are you serious? You're really gonna sit up here and let him continue to do this to you? He knew it. He knew that she wouldn't leave him as long as he said the right words. I didn't want them to get married. It took everything out of me not to object during the wedding. But I seen how her face was so lit up. She had the biggest smile on her face. You should have seen her, like her heart was so, it was so happy. I didn't want to be the one to ruin that for her because she had so many hopes, she had so many dreams to be a wife, to be a mother, to live in a stable household. I didn't want to ruin that fantasy for her.
And she came and she hugged us both and she was crying just to see us there. And she said, I'm just so happy to see y'all here because, you know, her sisters weren't there.
It was sad that my siblings weren't there. It was strictly because Chris did not want them there and they didn't feel welcome.
Chris wasn't going to accept anything that wasn't his way. If it was either his way or the highway. And if he said he didn't want someone there, then that person was not going to be there. He would get into fights at work. And his problems was he didn't know how to control his anger. He also brought recordings back to the house. The surveillance footage that he showed me showed him beating up the inmates so bad that he couldn't even move. They had to transport him to the ER with all his injuries. I couldn't look at that. It was too much for me. I've never seen that type of anger before in my whole life. He showed us so that way we can get in line also, to show like this is what he do to people that don't follow his rules. Chris was having troubles with his job. He was on suspension.
Olivia at that point had built up a clientele base where she had tons of clients utilizing her tax business. Seeing our family kind of struggle, it created an ambition within her for her to go out and want better in life.
She definitely made probably 2-3 times more than he did.
Olivia and Chris, what they did was start another business, which was a food truck business. So Olivia took the money that she earned and invested it into the food truck to get it up and going and get it running. And that way Olivia can continue to do what she was doing.
The idea, I would say, was his. but she was the one that was doing all the work. She was the one going to buy the food, prep the food, make sure the labels and stuff was correct. She made it seem like he did all the work, when in reality, the only thing he did was load the truck and cook the food. That was it. He just had her by the collar and just whatever he wanted, she was gonna go do. So graduating high school, I just knew that I was about to go to college. I was about to be free. And I just had a big sigh of relief of me finally getting away from that house. But it also scared me because I had to leave them behind. Not only my mom, but my sister. That wasn't how things were supposed to go. And yeah. On February 13th of 2019, I had a feeling that I need to talk to my mom and just let her know, like, hey, I love you. I'm gonna bring you your Valentine's Day gift up here tomorrow. After that phone call, I was a little uneasy, and that whole night I could not sleep. I just had a feeling like something was gonna happen, like something was off, but I just couldn't put my finger on it.
Beaumont 911, what is the address of your emergency?
I'm at home. My wife is shot at me. Please, her. Please, please. My wife, please!
On February 14th, I got a call from Chris around 9:12 in the morning, and he was basically saying, hey Ariel, something happened.
Come this way.
Okay.
Please, come this way. This way, this way.
Okay.
Please. Olivia!
Okay.
Baby!
Sir. Okay. Sit back. Sit back.
What's up, Mr. Booker?
I was like, is she okay? Like, what's going on? And he was like, Ariel, it don't look good.
Yes.
What happened?
We had a disagreement. And I say, baby, if you're not working with me, you're working against me. I say, we've been doing this. My 19-year-old stepdaughter was 8. My 11-year-old was 1. I say, Olivia, if we can't get it together, we can't be together.
Okay.
We got several, and I say, I just want a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And her reaction was, and I've been saying this for quite some time,
Mm-hmm.
and her reaction was, if you don't want me, I'm gonna kill myself.
And he said that she ran in the house and got the gun, and she put it up to her head, and she was telling him, if I can't have you, nobody can have you.
We got a loaded gun on the side of the bed. We got a loaded shotgun in the corner where the video games is.
And he said that when he was trying to get the gun, that it accidentally went off.
I said, give me the gun. She like, I don't remember which hand. I'm like, give me that gun. What is you doing? Stop trying to scare me.
Uh-huh.
I took it.
So when you grabbed it, it went off?
She yanked.
She
I
yanked.
grabbed it and she yanked back. And the gun went off.
Okay.
The gun went off.
All right.
And I did the best I could.
What's your last name?
Jones.
I got there in a matter of 15 minutes. I drove around the corner, all I seen was cops, and I seen the caution tape. The police officers, they stopped me, and I was just like, I just want to see her. I went to his mom and I asked her, like what's going on? Is she okay? Like, is she alive? And she had the same face Chris had, blank. And she said, Ariel, she's not alive. And I broke down.
I pulled up to a site that I thought I would never see, with police everywhere, with detectives everywhere, with crime scene tape everywhere. I pulled up to a nightmare.
When I got on scene, Olivia's car was in the driveway. Her keys were on the trunk of her car. Her phone was inside of her car. There was cold food product in her car, hamburger meat, things of that nature. There was a bouquet of flowers in the car that seemed to have been there for Valentine's Day. It seemed like she was in the middle of something that morning, and it got interrupted by this incident. We made our way through the house to find Olivia, and she was deceased in her bedroom. She was lying on the floor on her stomach, partially clothed. There was a great deal of blood. There was blood spatter. It wasn't until we rolled her over and saw an exit wound coming out of her left eye that we realized that the round had actually struck her in the back of the head. Something that we did notice throughout the home were cameras, surveillance cameras. So we were hopeful we would be able to get some information from those cameras. Absolutely nothing on that scene pointed to a woman that was suicidal or depressed or intending on taking her life that day.
They're waiting for the lead detectives. They're going to be the ones that actually interview you. So
we first met with Christopher Jones at the Beaumont Police Department. He agreed to speak with us, seemed very willing to do so, wanted us to know what he said had happened. They were preparing the food truck. Sometime during that preparation, he grew upset because he felt that Olivia was not doing her share of the work, had failed him and was not keeping up where she should.
There's no reason that certain things would need to be done. But I am very particular. If you heard that, that's true. I am very particular. You strive for the best for people. I work really hard, and I don't make excuses for myself. And I don't accept excuses for anybody else.
So because of these things, he decided he wanted to get a divorce. She stormed into the house, went straight to the bedroom, put a gun to her head.
what did you say?
Really? Are you serious? Really? This is not going to solve anything.
Okay.
You know, this is not, you do not want to do that. Put that freaking gun down before you make a mistake and hurt yourself. She was crying. She was crying.
Well, during this time, we happened to ask him about the surveillance cameras around his house. We asked if we could have permission to view those on his phone. He was very willing to allow us access to those cameras.
Say if you want to access just that camera, you touch that. And that's just that camera.
Okay.
You follow what I'm saying?
So far, let's go back to devices.
Yes, sir.
And
everything is labeled.
Carport, backyard, front door, back door, laundry room, inside garage, living room, kitchen.
But the videos weren't there.
Why would there be no recordings on it?
I don't know. It should be. But like I said, the internet, you can go through days and it pretty much does, we shouldn't have bought that. You just keep, like, you can pick whatever day you want and it's never going to be consistent. That's why I say it was a waste of money.
There was a change in Christopher's demeanor. He wouldn't look us in the eye.
Well, I'm wanting desperately to find some video on here that corroborates what you're telling us, but almost all the videos start right after this event happened.
His immediate reaction was that the system was faulty. He told me that he had been lazy in charging the cameras.
I was scared. I was scared.
Hey, have you been honest with me today?
Yes, ma'am. I was confused.
Look me in the eye.
I was confused about a lot of things.
Look me in the eyes. If you've been honest with me today, tell me how many videos you deleted.
It was obvious that he was being very deceptive.
If I deleted those videos, I look guilty.
Not if you say right now, or you just say a little while ago, I freaked out, I panicked, I did some stuff I shouldn't have done. Is that one of them?
Yes.
How many did you delete?
I don't know, honestly.
Okay.
How many had he deleted? And come to find out, everything except one camera. The only video that we saw around the time of the incident was the one showing that Olivia didn't go storming through the house. She didn't go to the bedroom. None of those things. She was actually in the kitchen, washing up, cleaning up from preparing food. Christopher was in the kitchen as well. He's the one that walked toward the bedroom first. He stopped in the hallway. When Olivia walked around to go toward the bedroom, she was startled to find him there. When that video ended, it was less than 3 minutes later that Christopher was on the phone with 911 saying that his wife was shot in the head.
I'm at home, my wife is shot in the leg. Please hurry, please, please. My wife, please!
I think the reason that one camera was still there is he ran out of time. When Christopher was supposed to be saving his wife's life, he was out in the front yard deleting videos. By the time that interview had ended that day, Christopher was placed under arrest for murder.
And there was several videos shown during that trial that showed him being an absolute monster to my sister. It was like a nightmare living that trial.
Then you gonna be looking stupid. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the floor, White. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the that is why is that like that? You're not paying attention. Look at you wasn't worried about the son of a bitch a minute ago. That's your mother. No! Look at me like that, bitch. I'm not playing with you, lazy. You want to do something now that I'm give it here. You got all the goddamn answers. You don't do a goddamn thing around this right. This your ass, bitch. That's clean dish. That's clean.
I didn't want to, they fell on the floor, so I didn't want to reuse them.
You look at this. You don't pay attention to what the you doing. You all over the place, Olivia. You ain't got the chance to claim no home. Food on the wall. Who you bringing now?
Me?
Harriet don't live here. It's you. It always been you.
Once I seen the video footage, I was just filled with sadness, so much sadness. I felt guilt as to why didn't I see that? Why didn't I know that she was dealing with it was just this bad? You know, why didn't I say something when I could have?
Typically, the victim will make excuses for the violent person. The victim will think that they can fix the violent person. And either way, they think that they're in love with the violent person. Once violence begins, it doesn't just stop.
Act like you ain't got no patience. You want to have a kid? I'll about my kid.
And I'm going to get emotional. It breaks your heart that she went through what she went through. It hurts to know that she, for whatever reason, could not remove herself from that relationship. And but for that, she would still be here today.
I can honestly say he took a piece of everyone's heart, everyone's soul. He crushed it.
Every day I put on this ribbon, this purple ribbon, I put that ribbon on every day in remembrance of her. And it signifies domestic violence. So I wear it every single day. I love her and I miss her dearly. It's a nightmare. Think about her all the time.
I want my mom to be remembered as that happy thought that everyone has, that place they go to when they need peace, joy, happiness. She deserved more. You know, like a smile that you see on everyone's face, like that's her. That food that you love, that's her. The one that makes your soul smile, that's how I want her to be remembered.
At 6:42 a.m., the phone rang inside a narrow brick house on the south side of Chicago, a sound sharp enough to cut through sleep, sharp enough to change a family forever, and when the receiver was lifted, there was no screaming, no dramatic pause, just a flat sentence delivered by a tired voice on the other end, a sentence that would echo through the neighborhood for the next 20 years. Your sister has been found. And before anyone could ask where, or how or why, the line went dead, leaving. Behind a silence heavier than grief, heavier than fear, heavier than the winter air pressing against the windows that morning. Chicago, 2003. A city already hardened by headlines, already accustomed to flashing lights and police tape, but this was different, because the body had been discovered in a place that felt impossible, wedged between familiarity and anonymity, a narrow service alley behind a row of closed businesses, trash bins still warm from the night before, the smell of oil and rust hanging in the air, and there she was, laid out like something discarded, coat half-buttoned, shoes still on, purse missing. No signs of a struggle that anyone could agree on, no witnesses who had seen anything worth remembering, just another scene cordoned off before the city fully woke up. Her name was Elena Morales, 29 years old, a dental assistant by day, a caregiver to her younger brother by night, someone whose life had been small in radius but heavy with responsibility, someone who walked the same streets every day and waved to the same shop owners and never once believed that routine could turn fatal, and yet here she was, reduced to a chalk outline that would wash away by noon. Another name added to a growing list that newspapers would summarize in a single line, if they mentioned her at all. Detectives arrived quickly, coats pulled tight, notebooks already open, eyes scanning for the obvious signs that never reveal anything, and the first minutes were filled with assumptions, with quiet bets placed in low voices, robbery gone wrong, wrong place, wrong time, maybe domestic, maybe drugs even though nothing about her life suggested it. And in those early hours the case felt solvable, manageable. Another puzzle that would slot neatly into the system, another statistic to be closed. Before the end of the month. But then the cracks started to show. No purse, no wallet, no phone, yet no forced entry into her apartment, no defensive wounds, no neighbors who heard a scream, surveillance cameras that should have seen something but somehow recorded nothing useful, a medical examiner who couldn't give a clean answer, time of death stretched into a window wide enough for doubt to live inside it, cause of death technically clear but emotionally hollow, leaving investigators with facts that refused to line up into a story that made sense. By the end of the first week, the word cold case hadn't been spoken out loud yet, but it hovered in the room, uninvited, unwelcome, the kind of word that settles in early and never leaves. Elena's family gathered in their living room night after night, blinds closed, television on mute, the glow of news coverage painting their faces in pale blue light, watching reporters mispronounce her name, watching experts speculate with confidence that felt insulting. And the most unsettling part wasn't what was being said, it was what wasn't, because no one seemed to know who had taken her or why, or how a woman could vanish from her own life and reappear lifeless in a place she had no reason to be. Friends came forward, co-workers were interviewed, ex-boyfriends were tracked down and ruled out, alibis stacked up like bricks in a wall that blocked every path forward, and every time investigators thought they had momentum, the trail thinned, went quiet, dissolved into paperwork and unanswered calls, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, urgency gave way to routine, routine to backlog, backlog to silence. Months passed, then years. The alley was cleaned. The tape came down. The city moved on. But the case didn't die cleanly. It lingered. It left residue. Every anniversary brought a short article. Every holiday reopened wounds. Every rumor sparked a brief flare of hope that quickly burned out. And inside the Morales family, something else was happening, something no detective could see from the outside, something tightening, something unspoken, a pressure building behind closed doors, where grief had begun to mix with suspicion, where questions that should have been asked early were avoided because the answers felt too dangerous. Because sometimes the most terrifying possibility isn't that a stranger did it. Sometimes it's the idea that the truth is already sitting at the table. As the investigation stalled, one detail refused to disappear, a detail small enough to be overlooked, strange enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to surface again and again in the files. A phone call Elena received the night she disappeared, logged by a cell tower just 3 blocks from her apartment, lasting less than 40 seconds, made from a number that didn't belong to anyone in her contacts, a number that would later be disconnected, unregistered, a digital ghost with no owner, and no explanation. Detectives flagged it, then deprioritized it, then buried it under new leads that went nowhere. Years later, that call would become everything. But in 2003, it was just another loose end in a case slowly losing heat, another line in a report that no one believed would matter, another reason the word Chicago cold case would eventually be whispered in precinct hallways with a kind of resigned familiarity, as if everyone already knew how the story was going to end. And yet, even then, something about it felt unfinished, unsettled, as if the city itself hadn't fully let go, as if the alley remembered, as if the silence that followed that early morning phone call was never meant to last this long. Because some secrets don't fade. They wait. The first year after Elena Morales was buried past like a blur, not because time healed anything, but because it numbed everyone just enough to function, and in that numbness the unanswered questions didn't disappear, they sank deeper, settling into the cracks of daily life where they waited quietly, patiently, feeding on every moment of silence, every phone call that never came, every knock on the door that turned out to be nothing. Chicago kept moving, traffic thickened, seasons turned, but inside the Morales household the calendar stopped meaning anything, because every day felt like the morning of that call all over again. Detectives checked in less frequently. At first it was weekly, then monthly, then only when something forced their hand, and each visit followed the same ritual, a few polite questions, a few careful notes, the same rehearsed assurance that the case was still active, that no detail had been forgotten, that progress sometimes took time, words that sounded hollow even as they were spoken, because everyone in the room understood what it meant when evidence stopped coming in and leads stopped calling back. It meant the case was cooling. It meant cold case wasn't a possibility anymore, it was a trajectory. The Morales family learned how to grieve in fragments. Elena's mother kept her daughter's room untouched, bed made, clothes still hanging in the closet as if she might come home late one night and need somewhere familiar to land. Her younger brother stopped asking questions altogether, retreating into a silence that felt permanent. And then there was Miguel, Elena's older cousin, who had moved in shortly after the funeral, offering help, offering support, offering to take care of things no one else had the strength to handle, paperwork, phone calls, bills, responsibilities piling up in the aftermath of loss. Miguel was practical, calm, reliable. He had always been around, always part of the family's orbit, the kind of presence so constant it faded into the background. And in those early months, his steadiness felt like a lifeline, someone who could be trusted when everything else felt unstable, someone who seemed untouched by the chaos, untouched by suspicion, untouched by the darker questions no one wanted to say out loud. Outside the house, investigators chased what little they had left. They retraced Elena's final known movements, confirmed by a co-worker who'd seen her leave work at her usual time, by a shop owner who remembered her buying groceries, by a neighbor who recalled the sound of her door closing sometime after 9. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that suggested she knew she was walking into danger. Her bank records showed no unusual activity. Her emails revealed no secret plans. Her life, on paper, was painfully ordinary. That ordinariness became a problem. Because crimes like this, crimes that leave no mess, no witnesses, no clear motive, they demand either extraordinary luck or intimate knowledge, and the longer the case went unsolved, the harder it became to ignore the uncomfortable implication that whoever killed Elena hadn't stumbled into her life by accident. They had known her schedule, known her habits, known when she'd be alone. The alley where she was found sat only a few minutes from her apartment, a shortcut she had no reason to take, a place she had never mentioned, a place that felt chosen, deliberate, as if someone had guided her there rather than chased her, as if there had been no struggle because there had been no fear, at least not at first. The phone call from that night resurfaced again during a case review 2 years later, when a new detective, fresh eyes, less invested in the assumptions that had already failed, flagged it as odd, not just because the number was unregistered, but because of its timing, 40 seconds long, placed just before Elena left her apartment, a call long enough to convey urgency, short enough to avoid explanation. Phone records confirmed it had pinged off a tower close enough to suggest the caller was nearby, possibly within walking distance. Someone close. Someone local. The problem was that by then, the trail was cold in every sense of the word. The number was gone. The device it had been called from could have been anywhere by then, dismantled, discarded, forgotten. The call became another ghost, another fragment of a story that refused to assemble itself into something coherent. Years stacked up. 5, 10. Chicago newspapers began referring to Elena's death as one of the city's lingering mysteries, a line item in articles about unsolved crimes, her name appearing alongside others, faces blurred together by time. Each story reduced to a paragraph, then a sentence, then a statistic. Community members held vigils on anniversaries. Detectives rotated out. Files gathered dust. And inside the Morales family, something shifted. Grief hardened into resentment. Resentment into quiet accusation. Conversations stopped flowing freely. Small disagreements took on outsized weight. Trust, once assumed, now required effort, and effort grew exhausting. Miguel remained the steady one, still living nearby, still checking in, still helping Elena's mother navigate a life she never planned to live, and yet, slowly, imperceptibly, his presence began to feel less like comfort and more like obligation. It started with money. A discrepancy noticed during a routine review of old documents, a utility bill paid twice, a bank withdrawal no one remembered authorizing, small amounts at first, easy to explain away. Mistakes happen. Grief makes people careless. But the pattern persisted, surfacing again and again in different forms. Never enough to trigger alarm on its own. Always enough to leave a faint aftertaste of unease. When confronted, Miguel had explanations ready. Logical ones. Convincing ones. He was helping. Covering expenses. Making things easier. And because everyone wanted to believe him, because questioning him felt like a betrayal on top of loss, the answers were accepted, filed away alongside so many other things that didn't quite sit right. Meanwhile, the case file remained open in name only. Every few years, it would be revisited, usually prompted by a new technology or a renewed push from cold case units eager to show progress. And each time, the same obstacles emerged: missing evidence, degraded records, witnesses whose memories had faded beyond usefulness, And always that phone call, sitting there like a loose thread no one could pull without unraveling something dangerous. By the 15th anniversary, Elena's mother stopped attending public events. The pain had calcified into something private, something she carried alone, and those closest to her noticed a change, a tension when certain names were mentioned, a tightness when certain topics came up, as if some part of her knew more than she was ready to admit, as if grief had taught her to recognize patterns even when she didn't want to. Then, in the fall of 2019, a routine audit request landed on a desk at the Chicago Police Department, part of a broader initiative to digitize old case files, and Elena Morales' name appeared on a list slated for review, just one among hundreds, nothing special, nothing urgent, until a junior analyst cross-referenced her file with a financial fraud investigation running quietly through the same precinct. The overlap was small, barely noticeable, but it existed, and for the first time in over a decade, someone looked at Elena's case not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a larger, messier picture, one where motives weren't limited to passion or chance, one where family ties could double as cover, one where secrets didn't just protect, they suffocated. The cold case stirred, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to remind the city that some stories never end when you think they do, that some truths wait patiently for the right moment to surface, and that when they finally do, they don't just shock communities, they fracture families from the inside out. And somewhere in Chicago, someone who had believed themselves untouchable felt the ground shift beneath their feet, even if they didn't yet know why. When the Morales file was pulled from storage, it didn't make a sound, no dramatic scrape of metal, no cinematic moment, just a quiet digital entry updated in a system designed to forget more than it remembers. But the silence around that action was deceptive, because reopening a cold case doesn't announce itself with sirens. It begins with a disturbance so small it barely registers, a line of data out of place, a number that shouldn't be there, a name appearing in 2 investigations that were never meant to touch. The analyst who noticed it didn't know Elena Morales, had never seen her face outside a grainy ID photo scanned into the file, didn't know the alley, the house, the family. All they saw was a pattern, financial irregularities connected to a low-level fraud probe, withdrawals made under the guise of caretaking, signatures authorized by trust rather than verification, and when that pattern brushed up against the timeline of a 20-year-old murder, curiosity took over where procedure usually stopped. It was enough to flag the case, enough to wake it up. Detective Laura Kincaid had been assigned to cold cases long enough to know the difference between dead ends and buried ones. She had learned to read old files the way other people read faces, noticing what was emphasized, what was ignored, what felt rehearsed. And when Elena's case landed on her desk, it carried a familiar weight, the heaviness of something unresolved not because it couldn't be solved, but because solving it would have required asking questions no one wanted to ask at the time. The first thing Kincaid noticed wasn't the crime scene photos or the autopsy report. It was the interviews. Pages of them, transcripts filled with cooperative language, polite responses, family members eager to help, eager to be useful, eager to present unity, and woven through them was one voice that appeared again and again, steady, articulate, always available, always offering context, background, clarification. Miguel Morales, cousin, caretaker, reliable presence, a man who had stepped forward in a vacuum and stayed there ever since. In the early days, his involvement had been framed as support, later as necessity. Now, reading it years removed from the emotion of the moment, it felt like proximity, constant and unquestioned, the kind of closeness that grants access without scrutiny. He had known Elena's schedule, had known her habits, had known the family's vulnerabilities after her death. And slowly, quietly, he had positioned himself at the center of everything. Kincaid reopened the phone records. Most of the data was gone, time having done what it does best, eroding details until only outlines remain. But the call from the night Elena disappeared still stood out, its timestamp preserved in enough places to be verified, and when Kincaid cross-referenced it with old cell tower maps, updated with modern modeling, the estimated origin radius shrank just enough to be unsettling. The call hadn't come from across town. It hadn't come from far away at all. It had likely been placed within a 5-block area surrounding Elena's apartment, an area that included Miguel's then address, a detail that had existed in the file all along, noted but never pursued, dismissed early because family members were rarely considered prime suspects unless something obvious forced the issue. Nothing obvious ever had. Until now. Kincaid requested a financial deep dive. What she found wasn't dramatic. No massive theft. No sudden windfall. Just a slow, consistent bleed of money from Elena's accounts after her death, funds redirected, expenses reimbursed without documentation, caretaking costs approved verbally and never questioned. It was the kind of activity that flies under the radar because it looks like responsibility, because it wears the costume of help. But when placed alongside the timing of the murder, alongside Miguel's immediate move into a position of trust, alongside his constant involvement in the investigation, it formed something uncomfortable. A narrative. The next step was delicate. You don't reopen wounds in families like this without consequences. You don't ask questions that imply betrayal unless you're ready for what comes back. Kincaid approached Elena's mother under the guise of an update, a routine check-in, her tone neutral, her questions gentle, but even then, the tension in the room was palpable, grief never truly leaving, only changing shape. When Miguel's name came up, Elena's mother hesitated. Just for a second, barely noticeable. But Kincaid saw it. That hesitation spoke louder than any accusation. It was the pause of someone who had rehearsed loyalty for years, who had defended a narrative until it became habit, and who now, confronted with the possibility that the past might not be settled, felt something shift inside her, a tremor of doubt she had buried too deeply to acknowledge. She didn't say anything incriminating. She didn't need to. That hesitation was enough. The investigation widened quietly. No arrests. No public announcements. Just a series of subpoenas issued under unrelated pretenses, bank records pulled, phone metadata analyzed with tools that didn't exist in 2003, each new layer peeling back a little more of the story Miguel had helped construct. What emerged wasn't a crime of passion. It was control. Elena had been planning to change her financial arrangements, to move money out of shared oversight, to limit Miguel's access, a detail uncovered through an old email draft saved on a forgotten backup drive, never sent, never acted on, but clear in its intent. She had felt something was off, had wanted distance, had planned to talk to him about it. That conversation never happened. Or maybe it did. Off the record. Off the grid. In the weeks leading up to her death, Elena's behavior had shifted in subtle ways coworkers hadn't thought to mention at the time, arriving early, leaving quickly, declining rides, avoiding certain calls, changes that meant nothing individually but, together, painted a picture of someone under pressure, someone who felt watched, someone trying to regain control of her own life. Kincaid revisited the alley. Standing there years later, it looked smaller, tighter, less anonymous than it had in the photographs, and she imagined the scene not as a sudden attack, but as a meeting, a conversation gone wrong, someone guiding Elena into a space that felt private enough to talk, familiar enough not to raise alarms. And when things escalated, there was no need for force, no need for witnesses, just proximity and trust turned lethal. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. Cold cases don't close on implication alone. They close on cracks. And Miguel was starting to crack. When he was finally contacted for a formal interview, framed as routine, framed as procedural, he agreed immediately, the same way he always had, confident, cooperative, unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. He spoke at length, filled in gaps, offered theories, repeated stories he had told before, but this time, the investigators were listening differently, not for content, but for consistency. They noticed where his timeline wavered, where details changed just enough to matter, where his memory sharpened around some moments and blurred around others. They noticed how often he steered the conversation away from himself without being asked. By the end of the interview, nothing had been proven, but something had been exposed. The image of a helpful cousin no longer held. Outside the interrogation room, Kincaid made a note that would later become pivotal, a simple observation written in the margins of a digital file. Subject demonstrates familiarity with investigative process inconsistent with stated involvement. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was smoke. And smoke, in cases like this, always leads somewhere. The cold case had stopped sleeping. It was awake now. And for the first time since 2003, the silence surrounding Elena Morales' death felt less like abandonment and more like anticipation, the kind that precedes a reckoning no one in the family was ready to face. Miguel Morales left the interview room the same way he entered it, shoulders relaxed, expression controlled, offering a polite nod as if the last 2 hours had been nothing more than an inconvenience, and for anyone watching casually, it might have seemed convincing, the image of a man with nothing to hide, but Detective Kincaid had learned long ago that innocence doesn't need choreography. And what lingered after Miguel walked away wasn't relief, it was residue, the sense that something had been performed rather than spoken, that the truth had been managed instead of shared. In the days that followed, Kincaid did something investigators are rarely afforded the time to do. She slowed down. She replayed the interview not for answers but for rhythm, noting where Miguel spoke quickly, where he paused, where his voice softened, where it tightened, and a pattern emerged, subtle but persistent. Every time the conversation drifted near the night Elena died, he became precise to the point of rigidity, dates exact, times memorized, as if rehearsed over years, as if those details had been preserved intentionally while everything else was allowed to fade. That kind of memory doesn't come from trauma alone. It comes from rehearsal. Kincaid reopened witness statements that had been deemed inconsequential, neighbors who had heard something but not enough to matter, a door closing, footsteps in a hallway, a voice raised and then lowered, fragments dismissed because they didn't fit the narrative investigators were chasing at the time. One statement in particular caught her attention. A woman who lived 2 floors below Elena, who had reported hearing voices arguing softly sometime after 9, not loud enough to be alarming, not violent, just tense, controlled, intimate. At the time, it had been written off as nothing. Now it felt like context. The woman hadn't recognized the male voice, but she had described it as familiar-sounding, confident, someone who belonged there, someone who didn't need to explain why he was present, and when Kincaid cross-referenced the estimated time of that argument with Miguel's stated whereabouts, a discrepancy appeared, small enough to miss, significant enough to matter, a 30-minute gap he had attributed to running errands. A phrase so vague it could swallow anything. Technology filled in where memory failed. Old traffic camera footage, grainy and incomplete, was reprocessed using modern enhancement tools, not enough to identify faces, but enough to establish movement, a figure matching Miguel's height and build captured near Elena's apartment complex within that 30-minute window, timestamped earlier than his interview timeline suggested. And while it wasn't proof, it was pressure, the kind that narrows possibilities until excuses start to collapse. Meanwhile, the financial thread tightened. Subpoenaed records revealed that Miguel had assumed informal control over Elena's accounts weeks before her death, citing her workload, her stress, her trust in him, and while nothing about that was illegal on its own, it established motive where investigators had once seen none. Control over money is rarely just about money. It's about leverage, dependency, silence. Elena's unsent email draft resurfaced again, its language studied carefully, not just for intent but for emotion, phrases that suggested fear masked as concern, discomfort framed as responsibility, and when Kincaid shared portions of it with Elena's former co-worker, a woman who had known her well, recognition flickered immediately. Elena had talked about Miguel, she said, not openly, not accusatorily, but enough to signal unease, enough to suggest boundaries being crossed in ways that were difficult to articulate without sounding ungrateful. That discomfort had never been documented. Now it was everywhere. The cold case unit met behind closed doors, the mood cautious but charged, aware that shifting a family support narrative into a suspect-centered one would bring scrutiny, backlash, questions about why this hadn't been done sooner, and the answer was as simple as it was damning, because no one had wanted to believe it. Family members aren't supposed to be monsters. They're supposed to protect. But history had taught Kincaid that proximity breeds opportunity, and opportunity, unchecked, can rot into something lethal. Miguel was brought in again. This time, the tone was different. Still professional, still calm, but firmer. Details were presented not as questions but as confirmations. The traffic footage, the financial access, the call proximity, each one narrowing the space Miguel had to maneuver. And for the first time, his composure slipped, Not dramatically, not enough to satisfy anyone watching for a confession, but enough to register a tightening of the jaw, a breath held too long, a flicker of irritation breaking through the practiced calm. He adjusted his story, just slightly, enough to align with the evidence. And that adjustment mattered, because lies that change aren't lies that survive. Outside the interview room, Elena's mother waited, unaware of the specifics, only sensing that something fundamental was shifting, that the version of the past she had clung to for survival was being dismantled piece by piece. And when Kincaid finally sat across from her again, this time without euphemism, without cushioning, the weight of that truth landed hard. Miguel was being investigated, not as a helper, not as a witness, as a suspect. The room went quiet. Elena's mother didn't cry. She didn't protest. She stared at the table between them as if it had betrayed her, as if it had been holding secrets she wasn't ready to confront. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, carrying a question that had waited nearly 2 decades to be asked. How could I not see it? Kincaid didn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't hurt. What followed was a slow unraveling, not the dramatic collapse people expect from crime stories, but something quieter, more devastating. Family members revisiting memories with new eyes, moments once interpreted as kindness now tinged with manipulation, support reframed as surveillance. And through it all, Miguel maintained his innocence, publicly cooperative, privately defensive. A man clinging to the idea that without a confession, without a weapon, without a witness, the case would stall. Again. But the difference now was momentum. Cold cases rarely explode. They tighten. Pressure builds incrementally, evidence aligning not into a single revelation but into an inescapable shape, and Miguel was starting to feel that shape closing around him, even if he refused to acknowledge it out loud. The alley was examined again, this time not as a random crime scene but as a chosen location, a midpoint between Elena's apartment and Miguel's old residence, a place familiar enough to feel safe, isolated enough to avoid interruption, and suddenly, the geography made sense in a way it never had before. This wasn't chance. It was planning. And planning leaves traces. The case was approaching a threshold, one that would force a decision, escalate charges, expose truths that could no longer be contained within files and interviews. And as the cold case unit prepared to move forward, they understood that what they were about to uncover wouldn't just close a file, it would detonate a family narrative that had survived on denial and silence for nearly 20 years. Because the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They're the ones we tell ourselves. And Miguel Morales had been telling himself the same story for a long time. It was about to end. Pressure doesn't always announce itself with raised voices or slam doors. Sometimes it arrives quietly, methodically, tightening one detail at a time until the story a person has relied on for years no longer fits the facts surrounding it. For Miguel Morales, that pressure began to change the texture of his days, the way ordinary moments suddenly felt scrutinized, the way casual conversations carried an edge he couldn't quite name, the way cooperation started to feel less like control and more like exposure. Detective Kincaid understood this phase well. It was the stretch where suspects often made their most consequential mistakes, not because they wanted to confess, but because maintaining a lie over decades requires precision, and precision erodes under sustained attention. Every new interview, every follow-up question, every document request forced Miguel to revisit a version of events he had long ago sealed off, and each revisit introduced the possibility of inconsistency. The cold case unit widened their net without announcing it. They didn't trail Miguel openly. They didn't confront him with accusations he could deflect. Instead, they rebuilt the world around him as it had existed in 2003, reconstructing routines, routes, relationships, the invisible architecture of daily life that often reveals more than dramatic acts ever could. They mapped Elena's final day minute by minute, then overlaid Miguel's movements on top of it, not as he remembered them, but as technology and records suggested they might have been. The picture that emerged was unsettling in its simplicity. Miguel had been close enough to intercept Elena without raising suspicion, close enough to call her from a nearby location, close enough to frame the meeting as urgent but private, something that couldn't wait, something that needed to be discussed face to face. And Elena, bound by family loyalty and years of trust, had answered. Kincaid revisited the call again. Not the number itself, but the duration. 40 seconds. Long enough to persuade. Too short for explanation. Investigators theorized the call hadn't been about logistics, but emotion, a tone designed to trigger concern, obligation, perhaps even guilt. Something along the lines of "we need to talk," delivered with just enough urgency to bypass caution. Once Elena stepped out of her apartment, the rest of the timeline narrowed sharply. The alley sat almost exactly between her building and the route Miguel would have taken home. A coincidence that no longer felt coincidental. It wasn't hidden from the city, but it wasn't visible either. A liminal space, easy to access, easy to leave, and in 2003, before the spread of modern surveillance, easy to forget. What happened there wasn't loud. That much had always been clear. The medical examiner's report suggested restraint without chaos, injury without prolonged struggle, a confrontation that escalated quickly and ended decisively. Investigators began to believe there had been no plan to kill that night, not initially, but rather a need to assert control, to confront, to force compliance. And when that control slipped, when Elena resisted or threatened to expose what she was beginning to understand, the outcome turned irreversible. This theory reframed everything. It explained the lack of witnesses, the absence of defensive wounds, the choice of location. It explained why the crime felt both personal and detached, why it bore the fingerprints of someone who knew Elena intimately but wanted the result to look impersonal enough to fade into the city's background noise. Miguel was invited back for another conversation. This time, investigators didn't ask him to recount the night Elena died. They asked him about money, about caretaking responsibilities, about decisions made on Elena's behalf, about why his name appeared so frequently in financial records tied to her accounts before and after her death. The questions were framed as clarification, as administrative necessity, but Miguel's responses began to fray at the edges. He grew defensive where he had once been accommodating. His answers lengthened, explanations stacking on top of explanations, logic circling itself instead of moving forward. At one point, without prompting, he mentioned the alley. No one had brought it up. The room went still. It was a small thing, easy to miss, easy to explain away. But Kincaid wrote it down anyway, knowing from experience that unsolicited details often reveal the contours of guilt more clearly than direct contradictions ever could. After the interview, investigators reviewed audio again, isolating moments where Miguel volunteered information rather than responding to it. The pattern was clear. He spoke most freely when he believed he was anticipating their questions, staying one step ahead, guiding the narrative back into familiar territory. It was a strategy that had worked for years. It was failing now. The breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic confession or a hidden weapon. It came from paper. A storage unit rental agreement surfaced during a routine background check, dating back to the months following Elena's death, leased under Miguel's name, paid in cash, discontinued abruptly after a year. Inside the unit, long since cleared out, records showed one item listed as disposed of through a third-party service. A mobile phone, model consistent with prepaid devices sold in Chicago in 2003, the kind of phone that wouldn't be tied to a contract, the kind of phone that would disappear cleanly once discarded. The implication was immediate. Miguel denied ever owning such a phone. The denial didn't hold. Witnesses from the time recalled him mentioning a backup phone during a work-related conversation. Not enough to prove murder. Enough to prove deception. And deception, when layered on top of opportunity and motive, becomes something prosecutors can work with. Still, the case needed one more anchor, something to connect Miguel not just to preparation and aftermath, but to the moment itself. That anchor arrived unexpectedly. A former resident of Elena's building came forward after seeing a brief news segment about renewed activity in the case. A man who had moved out of state years earlier, who had assumed what he'd heard that night was none of his business, but who now realized the timing matched too closely to ignore. He remembered a man standing with Elena near the alley entrance, voices low, posture tense, not a stranger, not a threat, someone she seemed to know, someone she didn't run from. He couldn't identify the man with certainty. But when shown photographs, his hesitation lingered longest on Miguel's. Not confirmation, but alignment. The cold case unit assembled everything they had, each piece alone insufficient, together overwhelming, and prepared to escalate. Warrants were drafted, prosecutors briefed. Internal debates surfaced about risk, about optics, about the damage such a case would inflict on a family already broken by loss, but the counterargument carried more weight. Justice delayed was still justice owed. When Miguel was informed that the investigation had entered a new phase, his response was measured, controlled, but something fundamental had shifted. The certainty that had carried him for years was gone, replaced by calculation, by the awareness that the story he had curated was no longer airtight. In the days that followed, his behavior changed. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Cooperation slowed. And that, more than anything, confirmed what investigators already suspected. Innocent people don't withdraw when the truth is being pursued. They lean in. The city hadn't heard the word yet. No headlines, no press conferences. But inside the walls of the precinct, everyone understood what was happening. A case long thought unsolvable was approaching its breaking point, and with it came the realization that the answer had never been hidden in the shadows of Chicago streets. It had been sitting at the family table all along, waiting. By the time Miguel Morales realized the investigation had crossed a line he could no longer manage, it was already too late to pull it back. The quiet questions had hardened into formal requests. The friendly tone had cooled into procedural distance. Doors that once opened easily now required warrants, signatures, justification, and each layer of formality stripped away another illusion of control. For years, Miguel had navigated the space between grief and suspicion with careful precision. Now that space was gone. Detective Kincaid didn't rush the confrontation. She understood that pressure works best when it feels inevitable rather than aggressive, when it closes in from all sides without ever raising its voice. Miguel was summoned again, this time not for an interview, but for what was described as a clarification meeting, language chosen deliberately, neutral enough to avoid panic, official enough to signal seriousness. He arrived on time, dressed conservatively, posture upright, the image of cooperation still intact, but beneath it, something restless moved. The room was smaller than the last one. No window, no distractions, just a table, 2 chairs, and a recorder placed between them, its red light a constant reminder that nothing said here would disappear. Kincaid began with routine questions, identity, address, confirmation of past statements, grounding the conversation in familiarity, letting Miguel settle into the rhythm he thought he knew. Then she shifted. She placed the traffic camera stills on the table. Not dramatically, not all at once, one image at a time, grainy, inconclusive on their own, but unmistakably similar to his build, his gait, his silhouette. She didn't accuse him. She didn't even label them. She simply asked him to explain how his recollection of that night accounted for being in that location at that time. Miguel hesitated. Not long, just long enough. His answer came smoothly, too smoothly, a revised version of an old explanation. Errands again, vague but confident, and Kincaid let it stand, nodding, making a note, then sliding forward another document. Phone tower analysis, the estimated radius circled in red, his former address sitting comfortably inside it. Again, no accusation. Just a question. How did he reconcile that with his claim that he hadn't been nearby? This time, his voice tightened. He leaned back, crossed his arms, shifted strategies. The conversation stretched on. Each piece of evidence presented not as a challenge, but as a puzzle he was invited to solve. And with each attempt, Miguel's solutions grew more elaborate, explanations branching, timelines bending, until the story he was telling no longer resembled the one on record. It wasn't one lie that stood out. It was the accumulation of adjustments, the way the narrative reshaped itself under pressure, revealing its fragility. Then Kincaid brought up the phone. The prepaid device, the storage unit, the disposal record. Miguel's reaction was immediate. He denied it. Flatly. Firmly. Too firmly. Kincaid didn't argue. She let the denial sit, then asked a different question, one that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with access. Had he ever used a phone that wasn't registered in his name? Had he ever borrowed one? Had he ever handled a device on Elena's behalf? The silence that followed stretched. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was the silence of calculation. When Miguel finally answered, his words were careful, hedged, framed to avoid commitment, and Kincaid recognized the moment for what it was. Not a confession, a fracture, the point where certainty gives way to survival. Outside the room, the team listened in, documenting every shift in tone, every deviation, knowing that trials aren't won on single revelations, but on patterns that juries can feel even if they can't articulate them. Inside, Kincaid continued, methodical, patient, circling back to Elena not as a victim, but as a person, asking Miguel to describe her state of mind in the weeks before her death. He painted a picture of stress, of vulnerability, of reliance, and in doing so, he revealed more than he intended. He described conversations no one else remembered, concerns Elena hadn't voiced publicly, worries that existed only in private spaces, only between two people, and as he spoke, Kincaid realized he was narrating a relationship closer, more intense, more controlling than anything previously documented. He was positioning himself not just as a helper, but as a gatekeeper. When the meeting ended, Miguel left without protest, but the calm he had worn so comfortably was gone. In its place was vigilance, every movement measured, every interaction filtered through suspicion, and in the days that followed, that vigilance turned inward, manifesting his errors. He missed a scheduled check-in. He contradicted a previous statement during a casual phone call with an investigator. He contacted a former acquaintance tied loosely to the case, a move that raised immediate alarms. The warrants came quickly after that. Searches of old digital backups yielded fragments, deleted messages recovered from devices thought long obsolete, pieces of conversations that hinted at escalating conflict, financial pressure, ultimatums framed as concern. Nothing that said I did it. Everything that said this was heading somewhere dangerous. And then there was the voicemail. Buried deep in an outdated server, mislabeled, nearly lost, a 40-second message recorded but never sent, Elena's voice tense, controlled, saying Miguel's name, saying they needed to talk, saying she didn't like how things were going, saying she wanted everything to stop. The timestamp placed it hours before her death. For the first time, Elena spoke for herself. The effect on the investigation was immediate. What had been theory hardened into narrative. What had been suspicion gained emotional weight. Prosecutors saw in it the missing link, the human element that explained motive not as greed or rage alone, but as fear of exposure, fear of losing control, fear of consequences that couldn't be managed quietly. Miguel was brought in once more, this time informed of the voicemail's existence. Not played, just acknowledged. His reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders slumped. His gaze dropped. The performance finally cracked enough to reveal exhaustion beneath it. Still, he didn't confess. He didn't have to. By then, the case no longer depended on his words. It depended on the story the evidence told when assembled without his guidance. A story that traced a straight line from trust to manipulation, from confrontation to silence, from a family secret carefully guarded to a truth that refused to stay buried any longer. The cold case had reached its point of no return. What came next wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be contained. And it would force everyone involved, investigators, prosecutors, and the Morales family, to confront a reality none of them had wanted to accept for 20 years. That sometimes, the person who stays closest to the fire isn't trying to keep it burning. They're trying to control the smoke. The shift from quiet investigation to public reckoning happened without warning, not because anyone wanted spectacle, but because secrets of this size rarely stay contained once they reach critical mass. A single court filing, routine in appearance, landed on a public docket one Tuesday morning, and by noon, Elena Morales' name was everywhere again, scrolling across news tickers, resurfacing in headlines that spoke the language of shock and disbelief. Chicago cold case reopened. Family member under scrutiny, 2 decades of silence questioned. The city remembered her all at once. Miguel saw it on his phone before anyone called him. Notifications stacked faster than he could clear them, messages from relatives, acquaintances, people he hadn't spoken to in years, all asking variations of the same question he had spent his life avoiding. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The story was already moving without him, and for the first time, he wasn't shaping it. Detective Kincaid watched the coverage from her office, volume low, recognizing the familiar pattern, the rush to simplify, to frame the case as a sudden twist rather than the slow, grinding accumulation of doubt it truly was. Reporters latched onto the phrase family secret, repeating it until it lost specificity, until it became shorthand for betrayal, and while the attention added pressure, it also brought something the investigation needed. People started talking. Former neighbors, old coworkers, friends who had faded into the background of Elena's life but never fully disappeared. Each call added texture, small memories previously dismissed as irrelevant now re-examined under a harsher light. A coworker remembered Elena asking about changing her emergency contact. A friend recalled her hesitating before attending a family gathering, saying she needed space but couldn't explain why. Another mentioned Miguel's insistence on handling certain matters alone, presenting it as concern but feeling, in retrospect, like control. None of it was explosive. All of it was consistent. Inside the Morales family, the reaction was seismic. The narrative they had protected fractured instantly, loyalty splintering under the weight of public scrutiny. Elena's mother retreated completely, declining interviews, declining visits. Her grief now layered with something heavier, a quiet reckoning with the possibility that the person she had leaned on most had been the architect of her daughter's absence. Other relatives were less restrained, anger spilling into accusations into arguments, decades of suppressed tension erupting in real time. Miguel stayed silent. On advice of counsel, he withdrew from public view, his house dark at night, curtains drawn, movements minimal, and that silence became its own statement, interpreted as guilt by some, dignity by others, depending on what they needed to believe. Investigators noted the change, the way his earlier hyper-cooperation had flipped into strategic absence, and understood it for what it was, the final stage of denial, the attempt to outlast the story itself. The prosecutor assigned to the case faced a difficult calculus. Circumstantial cases can win, but only if the story they tell is cohesive, intuitive, resistant to doubt. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness to the act. What there was motive articulated through control, opportunity mapped through proximity, preparation suggested through the phone and storage unit, and aftermath evidenced by financial behavior and narrative management. It was enough to move forward. Charges were filed quietly, then announced formally. Second-degree murder. The courtroom was packed on the first day, not with spectacle seekers, but with people who had followed the case since the beginning, journalists clutching notepads, advocates for cold case victims, family members sitting stiffly, unsure where to place their grief now that it had been given a shape they never wanted. Miguel entered in a suit that mirrored the restraint he had always favored, expression neutral, eyes forward, a man still trying to control how he was seen. Elena's photo appeared on a screen behind the prosecution, younger than many remembered her, frozen in a moment before fear and suspicion reshaped her world, and as the charges were read aloud, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the past had folded in on itself, forcing everyone present to share space with decisions made 20 years earlier. The defense strategy was clear from the start. They attacked the timeline, questioned the reliability of recovered data, framed Miguel's financial involvement as familial duty misinterpreted through hindsight. They emphasized the absence of direct evidence, the dangers of rewriting history to fit a narrative born of modern assumptions. It was a familiar playbook, one that might have worked if the case were built on one or two fragile pillars. It wasn't. Kincaid took the stand, methodical, unemotional, guiding the jury through the case as it had evolved, not as a revelation, but as a progression, showing how each piece, insignificant on its own, gained meaning through context. She spoke of patterns rather than proof, of behavior rather than motive alone, and when the voicemail was introduced, Elena's voice filled the courtroom for the first time in decades, calm but strained, carrying the weight of someone who knew something was wrong and hadn't yet found a way out. The impact was immediate. Jurors leaned forward. Family members looked away. Miguel stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, the sound cutting through years of speculation and landing with a clarity no argument could dilute. It wasn't a confession, but it was presence, Elena asserting herself across time, reminding everyone that this case wasn't about theories or headlines. It was about a woman who had tried to draw a line and paid for it with her life. Outside, the city reacted the only way it knows how, with noise, with debate, with opinions sharpened into absolutes. Some questioned the pursuit of a man, so many years later. Others saw it as overdue justice. Cold case advocates pointed to the trial as proof that time doesn't erase accountability, only delays it. For the Morales family, there was no clarity, only fracture, relationships forever altered by the public confirmation of what had once been unthinkable. As the trial progressed, the narrative tightened. Miguel's earlier statements were replayed, contradictions laid bare, small discrepancies amplified not to humiliate, but to illustrate a truth juries understand instinctively, that honesty doesn't require constant revision. Each day ended with the same question hanging in the air, unspoken but heavy. Was this enough? By the final week, the answer felt close. Not certain, but close. And that closeness carried its own weight. The knowledge that whatever the verdict, nothing would restore what had been taken, nothing would return Elena to the life she should have lived, and nothing would undo the years her family spent trusting the wrong person to help them survive their grief. The city waited. So did Miguel. And somewhere beneath the noise of cameras and commentary, beneath the arguments and objections, the cold case that had haunted Chicago for 2 decades stood on the edge of resolution, poised between the truth it had always held and the judgment that would decide how that truth would be remembered. The courtroom took on a different temperature as the trial moved into its final phase. A subtle shift felt rather than announced, the air thicker, every sound amplified, chairs creaking louder, papers rustling longer than necessary, because everyone inside understood what was at stake now. The story had been told. The pieces were on the table. All that remained was to decide whether they formed truth or coincidence. The prosecution slowed down. This was no longer about volume or momentum. It was about clarity, about walking the jury back through the case not as a sequence of accusations, but as a lived reality, asking them to inhabit 2003 for a moment, to imagine a city less monitored, a family bound by trust rather than suspicion, a woman navigating obligations she didn't know how to refuse. Elena's life was reconstructed not as a victim profile, but as a pattern of choices constrained by loyalty, by expectation, by a sense of duty that made confrontation feel impossible. They focused on the night itself, not theatrically, precisely. The 40-second call, the voicemail never sent, the route from her apartment to the alley, the absence of chaos at the scene. Each element was presented as a consequence rather than a mystery, the result of a meeting that began calmly and ended irrevocably. The prosecutor didn't say Miguel planned to kill Elena that night. Instead, they said he planned to control the situation, to force a resolution on his terms, and when that control slipped, violence filled the gap. That framing mattered. It explained why there was no weapon recovered, why there were no witnesses screaming, why the scene felt muted, almost respectful, in the worst possible way. It also aligned with the person Miguel had shown himself to be, a man who managed, organized, intervened, someone uncomfortable with uncertainty, someone who believed outcomes could be shaped if handled correctly. The defense countered with doubt. They questioned the reliability of enhanced footage, the assumptions built into cell tower analysis, the interpretation of financial records colored by hindsight. They reminded the jury that grief distorts memory, that stories evolve when people are asked to look back through the lens of tragedy, that suspicion can turn ordinary behavior into something sinister if given enough time. And then they returned, again and again, to what wasn't there. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession. They asked the jury to imagine the danger of setting a precedent where proximity and motive replace proof, where family members become suspects simply because they were close enough to care. It was a compelling argument, delivered calmly, designed to unsettle certainty without offering an alternative explanation. The courtroom listened. So did the city. Closing arguments arrived without fanfare. The prosecution didn't raise their voice. They didn't accuse. They asked a single question, repeated in different forms, circling it from every angle. If Miguel didn't kill Elena, who did? Not rhetorically, practically. Who else had motive? Who else had access? Who else benefited from her silence? The silence that followed that question stretched longer than any objection, hanging over the room like a held breath. When the defense rose, they offered restraint in return, cautioning against filling gaps with assumptions, urging the jury to remember that unanswered questions do not equal guilt, that the absence of certainty must always favor the accused. It was measured, thoughtful, reasonable. And yet, something had shifted, because by then, the case was no longer about a single act. It was about a pattern. The jury was excused to deliberate. Hours passed. Then more. Families waited in separate rooms, divided not just by walls but by years of unspoken tension. Elena's mother sat alone, hands folded, eyes unfocused, not praying for a verdict so much as bracing for one. Miguel remained composed, speaking quietly with his attorney, the image of control restored just enough to be convincing. Late in the evening, the jury returned. The room stood. The foreperson's voice was steady, deliberate, each word weighed before release, and when the verdict was read, it landed not with shock but with inevitability, the sound of something heavy finally coming to rest. Guilty. Second-degree murder. There was no outburst, no collapse. Miguel closed his eyes briefly, a fraction of a second, then opened them again, expression unreadable, the performance ending not with drama but with exhaustion. Elena's family reacted unevenly, some crying, some frozen, some staring straight ahead as if unsure what justice was supposed to feel like after 20 years. The judge spoke next, words formal, detached, outlining sentencing procedures, dates, next steps, language that felt procedural in contrast to the emotional weight of what had just occurred. Miguel was led away quietly, cuffs clicking softly, a sound barely audible beyond the walls of the courtroom but deafening to those who heard it. Outside, reporters spoke into microphones, voices urgent, phrases recycled instantly into headlines. Chicago cold case solved, family secret exposed, justice after 2 decades, and for the city, the story seemed complete, neatly packaged into resolution and accountability. But inside the Morales family, nothing felt complete. The verdict answered the question of who. It didn't answer why. It didn't explain how a family could orbit a truth for so long without touching it, how trust could be weaponized so effectively, how grief could be managed, redirected, used as cover. Those questions lingered, heavier now that the central mystery had been named. That night, Chicago slept uneasily. The cold case that had haunted it for years was officially closed, but the echo of it moved differently now, not as uncertainty, but as consequence, rippling outward through relationships, through memory, through the quiet realization that some endings don't bring relief. They bring reckoning. And reckoning has a way of lasting far longer than mystery ever did. The morning after the verdict, Chicago woke up to a city that looked exactly the same and felt profoundly altered, as if something invisible had shifted beneath the pavement, the way it does after a storm that never quite announces itself. Newspapers carried Elena Morales' name again, framed now by certainty rather than speculation, her photo printed alongside words like closure and justice, terms that read clean on paper but felt imprecise when held up against the reality of what her family was living through. Inside the Morales home, silence returned in a different form. It was no longer the silence of waiting or not knowing. It was the silence of aftermath, of emotional debris left behind after a truth finally breaks through. Elena's mother moved slowly through the house, touching familiar objects as if to confirm they were still real, pausing in her daughter's room, the one she had kept intact for years, now uncertain whether preservation still made sense now that the mystery it had housed was gone. Relief came in waves. So did guilt. The relief was in knowing that Elena hadn't been taken by randomness, that her death had a narrative, however brutal, that someone had been held accountable. The guilt was in recognizing the signs they had missed, the trust they had extended, the questions they had never asked because asking them felt like betrayal. Those two emotions collided constantly, leaving no room for anything resembling peace. Miguel's sentencing date was set for weeks later, a procedural gap that allowed public interest to swell one last time before receding. Commentators debated the length of the sentence, the nature of second-degree murder, the role of intent versus consequence, but beneath those debates ran a quieter current, one that asked how many other cases looked like this, how many other families were unknowingly protecting the very thing that had destroyed them. Cold case units across the country cited the trial as proof of concept, evidence that persistence mattered, that technology and time could work together rather than against each other. Advocacy groups reached out to the Morales family, offering support, inviting them to speak, to become symbols of endurance. Most invitations were declined. Visibility felt exhausting now. Grief, once public, wanted to return to private spaces. Detective Kincaid closed the file herself. She did it slowly, methodically, reviewing each document not out of necessity, but ritual, an acknowledgement that this case had demanded something from everyone involved and deserved to be ended deliberately rather than efficiently. She noted the final status change in the system, the digital equivalent of sealing a door, aware that closing a case doesn't erase its imprint, it simply redirects it. For her, the victory felt incomplete. There was satisfaction in resolution, yes, but also a lingering unease. The awareness that Elena's death had been preventable, that intervention, had it come earlier, might have changed everything. That thought followed her home at night, settled into her routines, a reminder of why cold cases never truly leave the people who work them. Miguel, now confined, began the slow process of becoming an inmate rather than a suspect. The transition stripped away the last of his carefully curated identity. There were no more narratives to manage, no one to persuade, no version of events that could soften the reality of where he was. In the quiet of his cell, the story he had rehearsed for decades finally had no audience. Whether he felt remorse was a question no one could answer. What mattered was consequence. Elena's voicemail, played again during sentencing, carried a different weight this time, no longer a clue but a testament, her voice no longer asking to be heard but existing as proof that she had tried, that she had recognized the danger and attempted to assert herself within it. The judge referenced it directly, noting not just the act of violence, but the abuse of trust that preceded it, framing the crime as one rooted in manipulation rather than impulse alone. The sentence was substantial, not dramatic, definitive. Outside the courthouse, reactions were muted. No cheers, no outrage, just a subdued acknowledgement that something long unresolved had finally been addressed. For some, it felt like the end of a chapter. For others, like the beginning of a reckoning with how easily familiarity can become a shield for harm. Time passed. Attention faded. Another story took the headline's place. But for the Morales family, the absence of noise was almost as jarring as the noise had been. Without the structure of court dates and updates, they were left alone with their thoughts, forced to renegotiate relationships that had been built around shared denial. Some connections didn't survive that process. Others emerged changed, stripped of illusion, bonded by a truth that hurt but no longer hid. Elena's mother eventually made a decision she had postponed for years. She packed up her daughter's room. Not to erase her, to release her. Each item placed into a box felt like an act of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that Elena's story, while no longer unfinished, would always remain present, not as a mystery, but as a memory that deserved space to breathe. When the room was finally empty, it felt less like loss and more like transition. The city moved on. It always does. But some nights, when the streets quiet down and the alleys fade back into shadow, the echo of cases like Elena's lingers, a reminder that closure is a concept invented to make endings feel cleaner than they are, and that justice, while necessary, is never synonymous with healing. The cold case was solved. The questions it raised were not. And in that unresolved space, between accountability and aftermath, Elena Morales remained, not as a headline, not as a statistic, but as a presence woven into the city's collective memory, a story whispered whenever someone wonders how close danger can sit to familiarity without being noticed. Years later, the case still refused to lie flat. It resurfaced quietly, the way unresolved emotions do, not with sirens or headlines, but with murmurs, citations, footnotes in training manuals, whispered references in cold case conferences where detectives spoke in low voices about the Morales file, about how proximity had masked violence, how certainty had been delayed not by lack of evidence, but by the comfort of familiarity. Chicago absorbed the story into its bloodstream, not as spectacle, as warning. In neighborhoods where people had once spoken Elena's name with caution, with that half-lowered tone reserved for tragedies that feel contagious, her name now surfaced differently. Parents mentioned it to teenagers when talking about boundaries. Community organizers referenced it during meetings about domestic violence, about the danger of assuming safety simply because harm wears a familiar face. The case stopped being about a single night in 2003. It became about the years surrounding it. The silence before, the normalization after, the cost of waiting for certainty that never announces itself. Detective Kincaid was invited to speak at a symposium on reopened cold cases. She almost declined. Public reflection felt indulgent. But when she stood at the podium, looking out at rows of professionals who had all lost sleep over files that refused to resolve, she didn't talk about technology or procedure. She talked about hesitation, about how many investigations stall not because evidence is absent, but because its implications feel unthinkable. She described the moment she realized the Morales case wasn't frozen in time. It was buried under politeness. The room was silent when she finished. No applause, just recognition. Miguel's appeals were brief and unsuccessful. Each was denied with language that felt clinical, final. His name stopped appearing in news feeds, then in search results, until he existed mostly as a footnote attached to Elena's. Inside the correctional system, he became ordinary, another inmate with a history that no longer interested anyone beyond intake paperwork. That ordinariness was the final erosion of the control he had once wielded. He was no longer the person everyone trusted, no longer the person who decided which version of the past survived. He was just a man who had been caught too late to undo the damage, but not too late to be named. Elena's father marked time differently. He stopped counting years since her disappearance and started counting moments where her absence was felt without warning: an empty chair at a wedding, a song on the radio she would have hated, the sudden urge to call her when something small and unimportant happened. Closure, he learned, wasn't an event. It was a practice, something you returned to daily, knowing it would never fully arrive. One autumn evening, he walked past the alley where she was found. Not intentionally, just by accident. The space looked smaller than he remembered, less dramatic, stripped of the weight it once carried. There was no marker, no plaque. Just concrete and shadow, and the residue of thousands of ordinary footsteps. For the first time, that felt right. The place didn't need to remember. People did. Cold case investigators from other cities began reaching out to the Morales family, not for interviews, but for permission. Permission to reference Elena's story when advocating for funding, for time, for the reopening of files deemed unsolvable. Each request was considered carefully. The family understood now that stories, once released, don't stay contained. They travel. They change shape. They become tools. And if Elena's story could help surface another truth buried under years of assumption, then perhaps its movement served a purpose beyond grief. Still, some nights were heavy. On those nights, Elena's voicemail replayed in the minds of those who had heard it too many times to forget. Not as evidence, as echo. The sound of someone sensing danger without having language for it yet, reaching outward, trusting that the people closest to her would hear the urgency beneath the casual words. They hadn't. That failure lingered longer than any verdict. The city's cold case unit received an anonymous letter months after the sentencing. No confession, no accusation, just a single sentence written in block letters. I always knew something was wrong, I just didn't think it was my place to say it. There was no return address, no way to respond. The letter was scanned, logged, and filed, another artifact of the case's extended shadow. It said nothing new. It changed nothing legally. But it articulated what so many had felt too late: the paralysis of doubt, the way uncertainty can masquerade as respect, the ease with which concern gets deferred until it becomes irrelevant. That letter haunted Kincaid more than any piece of physical evidence. Because it couldn't be cross-examined. Because it implicated no one and everyone at the same time. In classrooms, criminology students dissected the case. They mapped timelines, debated motive, highlighted missed opportunities. But the most animated discussions weren't about forensic technique. They were about psychology, about how communities create blind spots, about how trust, once granted, resists revocation even in the face of discomfort. Elena Morales became a case study, but to those who loved her, she remained stubbornly human. A laugh remembered imperfectly, a face that shifted slightly in memory each year, a life that never had the chance to become ordinary. The phrase cold case solved continued to appear in articles referencing her name, often paired with words like breakthrough and long-awaited justice. The language felt celebratory. Necessary, maybe, but insufficient, because solving a case doesn't restore what was taken. It only clarifies how it was lost. And clarity, while powerful, is not gentle. On the anniversary of the verdict, Elena's mother visited a small community center where a support group for families of missing persons met weekly. She didn't announce who she was. She listened. She recognized the cadence of uncertainty in every voice. The pauses, the hope that flared and retreated. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to offer reassurance. It was to say this: if the truth comes, it will not feel the way you imagine, but it will still matter. No one asked for details. They didn't need them. The Morales case continued to close doors it had once pried open. Media inquiries slowed to a trickle. Documentarians moved on to fresher mysteries. But somewhere in the city's deeper layers, in the places where stories are shared not for attention but survival, Elena's name still surfaced when conversations turned to intuition, to unease, to the cost of ignoring the quiet alarms that sound before something breaks. The case was over, but its lessons were still unfolding. And in that space between resolution and reflection, the true weight of the truth settled in, not as an ending, but as a reminder that the most dangerous secrets are rarely hidden far away. They live close. They eat at familiar tables. They wait patiently for disbelief to do their work. The last thing a cold case leaves behind is never evidence. It's atmosphere. Long after files are sealed and verdicts entered, there remains a faint pressure in the air, an almost imperceptible awareness that something once moved unseen through ordinary spaces and was only recognized when it was far too late. In Chicago, that pressure settled quietly into corners of a city, into kitchens where families spoke more carefully, into pauses between sentences when someone said, "He's always been around," as if longevity itself were proof of safety. Elena Morales' name stopped appearing in headlines, but it did not disappear. It softened. It slipped into conversations without announcement, into training slides without fanfare, into the private vocabularies people use when trying to explain why they didn't trust a situation but couldn't explain why. Her story became shorthand for something everyone understood instinctively but struggled to articulate: the danger of mistaking familiarity for innocence. On the street where Elena once lived, new families moved in. Paint colors changed. Porches were rebuilt. Children played on sidewalks that had once hosted candlelight vigils. The past did not announce itself there. It never does. But sometimes, late at night, when the city exhaled and traffic thinned to a distant hum, the block felt heavier, as if memory itself had weight. People who had known Miguel remembered him differently now. They replayed old conversations with new ears, noticing the pauses, the moments where he redirected questions, the way he inserted himself into decisions that weren't his to make. Those recollections were unsettling not because they revealed something monstrous, but because they revealed something mundane. There had been no dramatic tells, no cinematic slips, just a pattern of quiet control that only made sense in retrospect. That realization unsettled more than the crime itself, because it suggested how easily it could happen again. Detective Kincaid retired the following year. Her office was cleared by someone else, her desk wiped down, her name removed from the door. The Morales file was already archived, its digital footprint reduced to access logs and citations. But Kincaid carried the case with her in subtler ways. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before. Who spoke for whom in conversations? How often people apologize for asking reasonable questions? The small social reflexes that smooth over discomfort at the expense of clarity. She never stopped believing in justice. She just stopped believing it arrived on schedule. At a bookstore event unrelated to crime, Elena's sister once overheard strangers discussing the case. They spoke in the careful tones of people who knew the ending and were dissecting the journey, marveling at how long the truth had remained hidden. She didn't interrupt them. She listened. It was strange, hearing her family's pain rendered abstract, transformed into analysis and takeaway. What struck her wasn't their curiosity. It was their certainty. They spoke as if the signs had been obvious, as if distance made clarity inevitable. She wanted to tell them that inside the story, nothing felt obvious. That love blurs edges. That doubt doesn't feel irresponsible until it's too late. But she said nothing. Some lessons can't be transferred. They have to be learned the hard way, or not at all. Elena's voicemail was eventually returned to the family. Not the original. A copy. The digital file, once evidence, now existed only as memory. Her mother kept it on a small drive in a drawer she rarely opened. Knowing it was there was enough. Listening to it felt unnecessary now. The message had already done what it needed to do. It had spoken when Elena no longer could. It had bridged the gap between fear and recognition, even if that bridge had been built years too late. The word closure appeared less frequently over time. People stopped using it because it stopped fitting. There was no moment when grief ended or understanding settled into something comfortable. Instead, there was adjustment, a gradual recalibration of what life looked like with truth folded into it. The family learned to carry both Elena's absence and the knowledge of how she died without allowing either to define every breath. That balance was imperfect. It always would be. In police academies, instructors reference the Morales case with a warning: don't let your assumptions do the suspect's work for them. Recruits nodded, took notes, underlined phrases. Whether those lessons would surface years later, in a moment that mattered, was impossible to know. But the story had been planted. That, at least, was something. Chicago remained a city of stories. Some loud, some buried, some resolved only in the sense that they had been named. The alley where Elena was found never became a landmark. It wasn't supposed to. It returned to anonymity, its significance preserved only in memory and record. That anonymity felt appropriate. The crime had not required spectacle. It had thrived in quiet. So did its consequences. On the 20th anniversary of Elena's disappearance, there was no formal memorial, no press release. The family gathered privately. They spoke her name without hesitation now, without the sharp intake of breath that had once preceded it. They remembered things that had nothing to do with her death. Her impatience, her humor, the way she always corrected people gently, even when she was sure she was right. Those memories felt like reclamation. They belonged to the living. The phrase cold case solved still followed her story wherever it appeared, an efficient label that suggested finality. But anyone who had lived inside the case knew better. Solving it had not closed a door so much as illuminated a room that would always exist. A room filled with questions about trust, about timing, about the human instinct to look away when certainty feels disruptive. That room remained accessible. It always would. And perhaps that was the quiet legacy of the case. Not fear, not spectacle, but attentiveness. A slight pause before dismissing unease. A willingness to speak when something feels wrong, even without proof, even without language that feels strong enough. Because Elena Morales did not disappear into darkness. She disappeared into proximity. And it took decades to see that clearly. The city continued, indifferent and alive. Traffic lights changed. Voices overlapped. Life moved forward. But somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the daily churn of urgency and distraction, the echo of one unresolved moment lingered, reminding anyone willing to listen that the most chilling mysteries are not the ones that hide in shadows, but the ones that sit openly among us, waiting for disbelief to do its work. The case was solved. The truth was spoken. And still, the silence it left behind asked its own question, one with no verdict and no sentence, only a lingering weight that followed anyone who heard the story long enough to recognize themselves inside it. Not who did this, but who noticed too late, and whether next time someone might listen sooner. Silence does not end a story. It only changes the way it speaks. After everything was said, after names were fixed in ink and guilt was anchored to a sentence, the city slipped back into its rhythm, but the case continued to move quietly beneath it, like a current no longer visible on the surface. Not forward, not backward, sideways, into places where conclusions don't reach and certainty loses its grip. There were nights when Elena Morales felt closer than she ever had when she was alive. Not as a presence, as a question. In living rooms lit by television glow, people paused mid-conversation when a detail from the case surfaced unexpectedly, a tone of voice, a remembered unease, a moment they'd once dismissed because dismissing it was easier than naming it. Those pauses mattered. They stretched just long enough to allow discomfort to exist without being smoothed over. That was new. For years, the Morales case had been about absence, about a woman who vanished into the machinery of an indifferent city. Now it was about recognition, about what happens when people realize that the past does not stay where it is placed. That truth, once released, does not simply settle. It migrates. A patrol officer on the south side flagged a domestic disturbance that might once have been written off as noise. A social worker asked a follow-up question she might previously have skipped. A neighbor knocked on a door instead of turning up the television. None of these actions made headlines. None of them traced directly back to Elena Morales in any official way. But the pattern was there, faint and fragile, carried by people who had absorbed the story and felt its weight without knowing exactly how. Miguel's name continued to erode. In prison records, it was just another entry. In public memory, it thinned until it functioned only as context, never as focus. That erosion was not mercy. It was consequence. He no longer occupied narrative space. He no longer shaped the story. The control he had exercised through proximity, through trust, through patience, evaporated into institutional routine. What remained was the damage, and the learning curve that followed it. Elena's sister found herself correcting people gently when they spoke about the case, as if it were inevitable. She reminded them that nothing had felt predetermined from the inside. That fear doesn't arrive with instructions. That danger rarely announces itself in language sharp enough to cut through affection. Her corrections were not defensive. They were precise. Accuracy mattered now more than comfort. At a city council meeting unrelated to the case, a proposal was introduced to increase funding for long-term missing persons investigations. It passed without much debate. No one mentioned Elena Morales by name. They didn't have to. The shadow of the case hovered there anyway, an unspoken reference point, a reminder of what neglect looks like when it accumulates quietly over time. Detective Kincaid, now removed from the daily noise of the job, sometimes dreamed about files she no longer touched. In those dreams, evidence didn't lead anywhere. It simply existed, waiting. She woke with the understanding that not every truth wants resolution. Some want acknowledgement. Some want witness. The Morales case had finally received both, but the city was still learning how to hold that knowledge without turning it into spectacle. There were no anniversaries marked publicly after the 20th year. The calendar rolled on. But grief does not observe dates the way institutions do. It surfaced unexpectedly, in grocery store aisles, in the sound of footsteps behind someone too close for comfort, in the sudden realization that trust requires maintenance, not assumption. These moments were quieter than memorials, but more enduring. A criminology professor assigned the case to her students with one instruction: read it without looking for the twist. The point, she explained, was not the reveal. It was the delay, the years of normalcy that surrounded something profoundly wrong. The way social structures protect what feels familiar, even when familiarity becomes a liability. The students struggle with that. They wanted villains who looked like villains. They wanted warning signs bold enough to underline. But the Morales case resisted that framing. It offered instead a mirror, one that reflected how easily people accommodate discomfort when it arrives slowly, how loyalty can become inertia, how silence can disguise itself as neutrality. Elena's voicemail was no longer discussed publicly. It had done its work. What lingered instead was the idea behind it, the knowledge that someone had sensed danger and reached outward, trusting that someone else would translate unease into action. That translation failed once. The hope, fragile and unprovable, was that it might not fail again. Chicago remained vast and contradictory. It absorbed tragedy the way it absorbed everything else, by layering it into a history too dense to ever fully untangle. The Morales case joined that history not as an anomaly, but as a thread, one that intersected with countless others, visible only if you knew where to look. Some nights, the alley returned in memory, not as a crime scene, as a symbol of how places can be ordinary and significant at the same time, of how violence does not require dramatic settings, of how anonymity can protect both victims and perpetrators until someone insists on paying closer attention. That insistence came late, but it came, and that mattered. The phrase cold case Salt began to feel less like a conclusion and more like a hinge, a point where the story changed direction without actually stopping. Salt did not mean settled. It meant exposed. It meant named. It meant that what had once been hidden behind politeness and assumption had been dragged into clarity, where it could no longer masquerade as normal. In that clarity, there was discomfort. There was also possibility. Because clarity, unlike closure, demands participation. It asks something of the listener. The Morales family did not become advocates by choice. They became reference points. Their story traveled without them, shaping conversations they would never hear, decisions they would never see. That distance was necessary. Healing, they learned, required boundaries as much as truth. Elena Morales remained at the center of it all, not frozen in the moment of her death, but slowly recontextualized, remembered less for how she was lost and more for what her story revealed. That shift did not erase pain. It redistributed it, turning it outward, making it useful in ways grief rarely gets to be. The city did not promise to do better. Cities never do. But individuals did, in small, unmeasurable ways. A question asked sooner, a doubt taken seriously, a silence interrupted. These were not guarantees. They were gestures. And gestures, repeated enough times, become patterns. The case had ended. The echo had not. It moved quietly now, no longer urgent, no longer loud, but persistent, a low-frequency reminder that the most dangerous mysteries are not the ones that shock us instantly, but the ones that ask us to reconsider what we accept without scrutiny. Elena Morales did not get the life she was meant to live, but the truth about her death refused to stay contained. It pressed outward, unsettling comfort, demanding attention, altering the shape of ordinary decisions in ways that would never be traced back to a single file number or verdict. That was the final consequence. Not resolution, awareness. And as long as that awareness continued to surface, in moments too small to document and too human to control, the story did not truly end. It simply learned how to speak more quietly. And in that quiet it waited, not for another verdict, but for the next moment when someone chooses to listen before it's too late.